Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our next talk from the Scottish Centre of the Royal RMetS Society. My name is Gary Johnston. I'm the VP Scotland, which is the chair of the Scottish Committee Centre. I'm glad that you've managed to join us tonight, and I hope you're going to enjoy our talk. Just before I introduce our speaker tonight, could I just remind you that this talk is a free talk and it's been given by the Royal RMetS Society. And I would encourage you to visit the website and perhaps join the society. It is very worthwhile. If you've got an interest in meteorology, you don't have to be a meteorologist. And it is, there's a lot of talks, a lot of information, a lot going on, and I would encourage you to visit the website and consider joining. The talk tonight, along with other talks that we've had, are all recorded, and they are normally put up on YouTube afterwards, but this depends on the speaker and the permissions that he grants for doing this. So hopefully we can put this talk up after the event. You'll see on the right-hand side of your screen, there's a question board. Please feel free at any time to put a question up on there. The questions will be put up on the screen and read out after Matt's talk tonight, and he will quite happily answer any questions. So, on behalf of the Scottish Centre Committee, I would welcome Dr. Matthew Ayre tonight. Matthew has asked me to refer to him as Matt. Now, Matt is a historical climatologist at the Arctic Institute of North America. He specialises in the history and climate of the 19th century Arctic, with a particular focus on Arctic whaling trade. Matthew spends much of his time in the field, as he does in the archives, conducting fieldwork seasonally in the Canadian Arctic and the Yukon territories. Matt's talk tonight is on recovering observations from a whaling wreck in Baffin Bay. So in saying that, welcome Matt, and over to you.
Thank you, and thank you for the invite to talk. It's a pleasure. I'd really hoped to have done this in person. I think we've been waiting over a year nearly now to make that happen, but I'll get over to the UK as soon as I can. So I'm originally from the UK. I did my PhD at the University of Sunderland, and I lived on the northeast coast of England for all my life until I moved to Canada in 2017 to start my postdoc at the Arctic Institute, very much continuing my research in historical climatology using 19th century British Arctic whaling ship logbooks to look at the past climate of specifically Baffin Bay, so between Greenland and Canada. I'm going to give you a little bit of background on that, and then the main body of the talk is going to be on something that threw a little bit of a spanner in the works in my research and put me on a totally different direction for the last couple of years, although I still do some of the climate stuff. So my sources are from the British Arctic whaling trade. This was pretty much the original oil trade you can think of it as. It occurred over the period of about 400 years, starting in the mid 16th century actually, and working its way all the way up into the early 20th century. It was predominantly ships sailing from the east coast of England, from London up to Peterhead, and they would stop in Orkney or Shetland to pick up crew. The first area where they were hunting the bowhead whale, which was these fat, large Arctic living whales, was between Svalbard and the east coast of Greenland. And then as the trade progressed and these stocks of bowhead whales had been hunted to near extinction, the trade moved its way into the Davis Straits and Baffin Bay between the west coast of Greenland and Canada's Baffin Island. Bowheads are pretty remarkable creatures. I've been lucky enough to see a few up there now, but they're the world's oldest living mammal. They can live over 200 years old. In fact, they're still subsistence hunted in parts of the Arctic. I think it was 2011, there was a subsistence hunt in Alaska, which caught a particularly large whale. It still had a harpoon in it from the 19th century, which is just ridiculous when you think about it. They were hunting it mainly for its blubber, which was rendered down into oil. This was used to light street lamps, treat fabric, lubricate machinery. It went on to start the bottled gas industry. It was very versatile research. You used it in soap. Another byproduct of this hunt was the baleen, which the whalers would term whalebone. It's this flexible keratin material that you find in the mouth in replacement of teeth. These are filter feeders. But this was used, this whalebone, this baleen was used almost exclusively in the women's fashion industry. It was used to make the stays in petticoats and in corsets, but you also find it on decorative spoons. It's the stem on the handle, and in umbrellas as well. But it's the documents, the logbooks surviving from these trade, which is really where I get my information. We all know of climate change, and we all know of the impact the gradual, or I should say rapid warming of our atmosphere is having on the Arctic regions. It's warming almost 4 times as fast as the rest of the planet. And a particular consequence of that is the reduction in sea ice. It's very likely we're going to see sea ice-free summers in the entirety of the Arctic by 2050. And this wasn't always the case. These logbooks show it. So there's not many that survive. There's about 300 of over 6,000 voyages. For the Davis Straits and Baffin Bay, where I look, there's about 130, of which I've now tracked down and imaged and transcribed the majority of. And that each daily observation is jam-packed, full of environmental information that I go through in mine and then can use that to look at the past climate. So just highlighted here, we have just an extract from a day. This is Thursday, July 10th. In this first column, you can see wind direction. So it starts off at south, and then it goes into the daily description of the day. So first part, light airs and thick. So this is saying how strong the wind is and what the weather's like. So thick's kind of humid and mud. And then it goes along, it says, at 2 p.m., made sail and plied to windward along the edge of the ice, several ships and company. So now we know they're at the edge of the ice, and this is the sea ice, and they had several terms to describe the sea ice. So you're not just ice or no ice, you can tell how thick the ice was, and therefore how old it was as well. And you can use the fact that we know they're in company with several of the ships to try and validate this information against another logbook, which might be in the same location at the same time. They go on to say at 5 they saw 2 fish. Was it saw a fish? They're not talking about fish, they're talking about the bowheads here. They were unsuccessful on this day, and they go on, the last bit I've highlighted is more clear, ship dodging at the edge of the ice, distance from the land 35 or 40 miles, latitude by account 73 degrees north, 73 degrees 33 minutes north. Now we can place it, so we know the exact date, we know exactly where they were, and we know they saw sea ice. So if you go through these logbooks and you start to plot each one of these for, say, a given month within a decade, you start to build up an average picture of the ice. And what you see is in the 19th century, the sea ice doesn't melt back in its entirety like it does now in Baffin Bay. So I've been, I go to Baffin Bay almost on an annual basis now, in the latter half of the summer sea ice season, so end of August, early September. I've been there during sea ice minima, and there's no sea ice in Baffin Bay at that point. It's all open water. But I have logbooks in my hand from the same date that say there was 15 miles of landfast ice, or they were at the edge of the pack ice. There's a very clear and observable difference. And in 2018, I was going through these logbooks and continuing to transcribe them. It's been a near decades-long worth effort now, but we're finally coming to the end. And I came across this account, and this is from the 1902 logbook of the Diana, which was a Dundee ship. At 8 a.m., moderate breezes, southeast, snowing. One of the Nova Zembla's boats came alongside and reported to us that the Nova Zembla was ashore a little to the south, and that the water was up to the 'tween decks. So Nova Zembla was another Dundee ship, and this is clearly an account of the Nova Zembla wrecking, which, to be honest, isn't that unusual. You know, there was over 200 British ships lost in Baffin Bay over the period the whaling trade was happening there, and you know, I come across wrecks almost in every logbook I have. What was interesting was I then had a 1903 logbook from the Diana, and it said they went back to the wreck and that it lies on a shallow rocky bottom, and that they salvaged the rudder. And that was pretty interesting. It kind of piqued my interest because you could see it, they could access it. Maybe we could find it. So this is Nova Zembla. It's one of the few historical photos that survive. Built in 1874 in Bremerhaven in Germany, alongside its more famous sister ship, the Vega. Vega was the first ship to ever sail the Northeast Passage, so up above Russia to the Pacific. 170 feet, 270 tons displacement, 52 horsepower steam engine. It's quite a sleek ship. It was known as one of the fastest ships in the fleet that survived then. And it was sank by Captain John Cooney. And Cooney had been the Nova Zembla's first mate for nearly a decade, and this was the first year he took over the captaincy. So Captain Guy, who had previously been captain and retired at the end of 1901, Cooney took over and sank Nova Zembla on his first go, which was slightly embarrassing. The owners then replaced Nova Zembla with Vega, very similar ship, almost identical, although slightly smaller. And in 1903, guess what Cooney does? He loses Vega in the ice. Then he gets command of an even more famous ship, the Windward. So the Windward at this point, it was built in Peterhead as a whaler, but it was used in Peary's first North Pole expedition, and it was used as a support ship for Franz Josef Land expedition, and it brought Nansen back from the Fram, from his famous Transpolar Drift expedition. It then went back to being a whaler, and in 1907, so only another 4 years later, Cooney loses the Windward in northwest Greenland. So, in 5 years, he's lost 3 ships. He's not exactly the most lucky captain out there. Well, there's the Windward. There's the Vega on the left there and the Windward on the right. But back to Nova Zembla. I was pretty interested that they could see it, and I kind of had this pipe dream that we might be able to find it. And it's currently, there was no known surviving British Arctic whaling wrecks in the high Arctic. So I started doing some more historical research and went to the newspaper archives. All the crew survived. They were rescued by the Diana and the Eclipse, who were around the corner in the fjord that Nova Zembla was trying to get to. We had pretty detailed accounts, so we know that Nova Zembla wrecked at 10:20 p.m. on the 18th of September 1902. It was a blinding snowstorm. It ran aground a mile south to the entrance of the natural harbor it was trying to get to, 300 yards off a beach. And all this information comes from interviews newspapers did with the crew. It goes on to say that the masts fell off and the engines were pushed through the decks, that they tried to launch one of their whaling boats and it was washed away and crushed, and that eventually they rowed the 2 hours around the rocky promontory that protected the natural harbor, and found Diana and Eclipse. When they were all safely aboard, they set fire to the remainder of the wreck and left. And through all that information, we were able to get a chart and basically pinpoint the exact location where we thought Nova Zembla was. The problem was, it was on about the most remote point you can get on the east coast of Baffin Island, high in the Canadian Arctic, which is already an extremely remote place to begin with. This was kind of difficult. So, and a very expensive place to get to, and we had no money. We used this historical justification to persuade the director of the Arctic Institute to give us a bit of money, and she agreed as long as we got match funding from somewhere else, and we were lucky enough to get expedition funding from the Royal Canadian Geographical Society. But if I'm honest, this was barely enough to cover flights up there. It's cheaper to buy a round-the-world flight than it is to fly from Calgary up to Pond Inlet at the northern coast of Baffin Island. But there's a lot of cruise ships, these small cruise ships that take around 100 passengers are operating in this region. And one of them was going right past our site. So we got into contact with them and asked very kindly, would you be willing to help us and stop off at this location just so we can check to see if this wreck's there. We think it is, but we don't want to. It's a huge investment to get up there. This would be a really quick way. They agreed. They said, we'll give you 7 hours and one of our Zodiacs, our rubber dinghies, and you can go check. So in the summer of 2018, less than 6 months after I read that first account, we boarded this ship and sailed out through the Northwest Passage and down the east coast of Baffin Island. We arrived on site, and there should be a video playing in a moment. So, as you can see, the weather wasn't great. We had about 5 foot of swell. It was windy. It was cold. Could we have the next slide, please? But at least we were there and we could check. We've done some satellite analysis based on where the search area we defined, and we had this anomaly on the satellite image that looked like a ship. It was the right length. It was the right width. It was on the right heading. It had a sediment plume coming off it. It was slightly at the extremities of our defined search area, but we were fairly confident. We headed there, and it turned out to be a very ship-shaped rock, or collection of rocks, which was slightly disheartening. But we devised a search grid up and down the reef to see what we could see. We couldn't afford a side-scan sonar, so we brought with us a fish finder. And then we proceeded to spend about 5.5 hours getting extremely cold. I got mildly hypothermic. Thankfully, one of the ship's staff, an Inuit gentleman named Ted, who grew up and lived and hunts in the Arctic, was there with his polar bear pants. He gave them to me and said, like, you're too cold, put these on. Hands down the warmest thing I've ever worn. But we were trundling back and forwards and seeing nothing. The swell really wasn't helping the fish finder. And with less than an hour to go, we decided to abandon that and throw the drone in the air. And I'd noticed what looks like a piece of wood on the beach. We weren't allowed on the beach. We didn't have permits at that point. We only had a permit to do a water-based search. So looking through the binoculars, I see this piece of driftwood on the beach, which is very unusual in this part of the Arctic. There's no trees in the Arctic. Any piece of driftwood that's made it there has either come from something made of wood in the Arctic that's sailed up to the Arctic or been transported up into the Arctic, or it's drifted an extremely long way. So we had this little drone with us. We bought it from the Apple store on the way there with the idea that we were going to film some of this. It's meant to have 20 minutes flight time. We launched it from the boat. I moved it over the beach, where it immediately started telling me it had less than 4 minutes left before it was going to drop out the sky. But what we saw was immediately evidence that it was wreckage from a sailing ship and from an old sailing ship. You can see these timbers here. Some are structural, some are spars. They've got rivets and iron fixings sticking out from them. And we managed to take about 16 photographs before we really had to get the drone back. And we actually caught the drone with 3 seconds left before it was going to drop out the sky, which was a huge relief, because this was enough evidence to say we had at least found what we thought we were coming to look for, at least some of it. Not a huge amount, but in these images there was a block and tackle. It was clearly an old sailing ship. So then we tried to position ourselves 300 yards offshore from where we saw this wreckage. because those historical accounts said that Nova Zembla ran aground 300 yards offshore. They also said one of the first things that the captain ordered was the anchors to be dropped. These are some of the heaviest things on board. If they drop the anchors, maybe they can float themselves off the reef. They were unsuccessful, but we positioned ourselves 300 yards offshore, kind of between some breaking waves. It's fairly precarious, but we had a small remotely operated vehicle that we chucked in the water. And we sort of just blindly drove it around for a bit. I'll be honest, we forgot we did this for about 2 days. We were that cold and that exhausted. But when we reviewed it, my colleague and underwater archaeologist Mike Maloney, who I work with, paused the footage and went, look at that. And I've highlighted on here because the resolution's not great on the slide from the screenshot, but there was an anchor with the chain hanging off it right there. Right next to what you can see is a straight line about the same color as the anchor. We think this is the scour mark where the hull hit the reef, went along it and got grounded. And when we look at this footage a bit further, there is something in the distance that looks potentially like it's another anchor, but we really couldn't be certain, whereas this one we're extremely certain this is the anchor. So this really gave us confidence to state that this was the wreck site of Nova Zembla, and what we're seeing was from Nova Zembla. Unfortunately, then we had to leave, which was a real shame, because we just found what we were looking for. But we left and we had to wait a full year before we could return. But now it was clear we really needed to get on the beach. So we got some more funding from the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, some more funding from the Institute, and then we applied for a bigger academic grant to do this work and were unsuccessful. So with even less money than we had the first year, we scraped our way up to Pond Inlet. I hitched a ride on a cruise ship. And then we were very kindly given a week's ship time on board the government of Nunavut's fisheries research vessel, the Nulialuk, which you can see here. Nulialuk is a converted 65-foot crab trawler. It's very cramped, but we were very thankful to be on board. It was a pretty interesting passage down from Pond Inlet. It took over 20 hours in some fairly big swell. We had a storm on the way, and we were really quite unoptimistic we were actually going to land on the beach. Having been there in 2018 with a small amount of swell, like there was no hope we were going to get on the beach. But when we arrived, this was what the weather was like. It was glorious. It was flat calm. We had a geologist with us who'd been working in the area the week previous. He'd flown over the site and counted 8 polar bears, which was slightly unnerving. It's really the only low-lying area of land for a couple of 100 kilometers either way. And the polar bears tend to congregate here in summer because snow geese nest there. So it's pretty easy pickings food-wise. Obviously not great for walking along the beach and seeing if there's any wreckage there. We had one gun between 5 of us. Thankfully, we didn't have to use it. There was a light offshore breeze, so it kept any polar bears that were inland away from us because they couldn't smell us. So we landed on the beach, and it was immediately evident we had missed a lot in 2018. The beach is about 4 kilometers long, and the whole beach was covered in wreckage. This is one of the pieces we actually photographed with the drone from 2018, and then this is us finding it on the beach in 2019. It's kind of the base of the bowsprit, so that the spar that would come forward off the bow. It still had wire on it, it still had rope on it, it still had paint surviving on it. It's fairly impressive. We found the masts, so we know from the historical accounts that these masts had fallen off during the wreckage. What was really interesting was they had some clean cuts to them, but cuts that looked like they'd happened at the time they were lost because the weathering was almost exactly the same. And if you can imagine the masts falling down as the boat's breaking apart. It's still connected by all this wire and rope rigging. That's all connected to the hull. And as the waves are starting to fill the sails and push the mast, they're starting to pull the hull apart. So the crew would have dashed around like crazy trying to cut off all these masts as quickly as possible, which is why we find them high up on the beach. And they've been there for 118 years. More pieces of mast there. We find bits of the rigging, this block and tackle. This is the end of a yard arm, so the spars that sit perpendicular to the masts. Again, it's been cut near its end. Then we found this small piece of wreckage here, clinker-built construction. And this was the whaling boat they lost when they initially tried to get off board, off the ship during the first few moments of that wreck. But what was fascinating about this is, well, one, it lines up perfectly with the historical accounts we have from the crew's interviews in the newspapers. But two, it still had paint on it, and it had yellow and green paint, which is something we'd never known. I'd read that, individual crews on each of the 6 whaling boats most whalers would take with them were very proud, and they would decorate their boats, and there'd be a lot of competition in between the boats as to who was successful. We weren't quite aware about how these were decorated or even what color they were. All the images are in black and white. There's very few paintings, and there's only the odd painting, and that's a snapshot from a certain time. What we also found near this was some floral carving, which was pretty interesting as well. So these, there's a lot of pride taken in these boats. Then we found what, to me, is possibly the best finds we found on the beach. These ornate bits of floral carving, just lying on top of the sand. Some of them had a bit of sand on that we brushed away. Unfortunately, we only had Class 1 permits, which meant we could record, but we couldn't recover. So we had to leave these on the beach. But they were amazing, and some of them still had some paint on, and there was evidence that these were painted in, perhaps a yellow or a gold. We found this barrel, which has a patent date of June 3rd, 1902. This is an oil barrel, so it would have been carried by steamships for their engines. This is probably unlikely from Nova Zembla, though, because Nova Zembla sailed before June 3rd, 1902. But the harbour that was nearby was regularly used up until the end of whaling, which occurred around the start of World War I. So it's potential it could have come from another Scottish ship. I think more likely it's probably come from the Canadian government exploration ship, the Arctic. But that's something I need to look into more. It's certainly a curiosity. We found a paddle, which was probably a steering oar, and then one of the main oars from the whaling boat, probably from that initial one that was wrecked. This was on the next beach south, but pushed up above the high tide line and in an imperfect state of preservation. It was really quite amazing. All this stuff is just there. 118 years later, it's been left to the elements. It gets frozen over every year. It gets ice rafted, subjected to storms. But it was really evident that not a lot of people visit this spot, if anyone. Then we found the hull, or at least a section of the hull, from what we could measure that was sticking out the sand here. This was over 60 feet long. And this was pretty interesting because it shifted our focus away from the reef and more onto the beach. Now that we know that the likelihood is most of the ship has been deposited on the beach and then spread around. Heavier things like the boiler and the anchors are likely still in the water. And we did try to do an underwater survey. And even in this calm weather, the cross-shore current is so strong that really wasn't very successful. We couldn't find the anchor again. Even though we had a relatively good position, we had about a 100-foot radius from the GPS point of the boat when we found it in 2018. But we had an incoming storm, so we focused mainly on the beach. But aside from all the wreckage, which was extremely interesting and and amazing at how well preserved it was. There was other things that didn't make sense. There was evidence this wreckage has been used and moved and salvaged in some way. So we find these evidence of bridges, of these planks that look like they've been purposely moved over old streams. And then we found some burned pieces of wreckage that still had iron rivets through them in a seal hunting blind, and a really old seal hunting blind, given the amount of lichen on the rocks there. This made absolutely no sense. Why salvage these bits, but leave a whole beach worth of wood and metal, which are all super important resources, even at the start of the 20th century when there's more Western trade coming to the Arctic. It made no sense, and it was something that was really confusing at the time. But eventually we had to leave. We did a full aerial survey of the beach. This is just a drone photo after the survey of a section of the beach, but even there you can pick out parts of masts and the hull further down the beach. It was a pretty beautiful spot to be. When we got back, I started doing some more research. I'd known that there was an 1884 painting of the Nova Zembla. I'd found a record of sale on an auctioneer's website, but no image. And I'd known about it for about a year. And I did some more research, and every now and then I just Google it and start digging. And eventually I found it for sale in Pennsylvania, which was quite bizarre. And there was a gentleman I was talking to at the time who lives in Calgary, who bought it on behalf of the project, which was amazing. And he's had it fully restored. And I now have a copy in my house, which is great. But what's really interesting is it shows us a couple of things. One, the whaling boats are a different color to the one we find. So these have all got blue stripes on it. But it's likely that this was painted for the owners of the ship. So the Flag Dundee Polar Fishing Company, they owned the ship. This was probably in their boardroom. But the most interesting thing was the bow. We see this gold floral carving on the painting. And it doesn't take too much imagination to match that to the carving we find on the beach, which was pretty cool. But it still didn't answer any of the questions as to these moved pieces. So I go back to my climate research. I'm now transcribing an 1899 diary from the ship Eskimo, which is another Dundee whaling ship. And it's the diary of Andrew Barclay Walker Jr., who was, I think their family purchased the ship because he wanted to go hunting in the Arctic. So he's there with a couple of mates alongside the whaling voyage, but he's shooting walrus and polar bear and generally just exploring and having a good time. He actually published this diary. It's a book, you can buy it. But in it, they get to this harbor, and he says that he examined the wreck of the Eagle. You can see her engines plainly under the water. So this is round the corner from the wreck of Nova Zembla. There's another ship there. This ship turns out to be the Eagle of St. John's. It was built in Dundee alongside the Discovery, which sits in the dock there now. So a very similar ship, if not a sister ship. But it was sold to St. John's, and it was used as a whaler in the Arctic. But it was stove in the ice in 1896 up near Pond Inlet and limped down to this harbor. On consultation with all the whaling captains that were using this harbor, they decided that the Eagle wasn't seaworthy, it wasn't going to make it back to St. John's, and they should abandon it there. So they run it aground on a beach alongside the inside of the harbor, conveniently called Eagle Beach. I happened to walk this beach in 2019 when we were there because we had to retreat to the safety of the harbor when the storm eventually came in. And this was before I knew anything about the Eagle. And we found small pieces of wood again, clearly from a ship, which we had assumed had washed around from the Nova Zembla site. Now, not so much. I took this photo, which conveniently almost perfectly lines up with this image of the Eagle being ran ashore. Probably not quite, but certainly that hill in the background is the island on the other side of the harbor. So the question is, why is the Eagle almost not there? it only wrecked 8 years before Nova Zembla. And Nova Zembla appears to be all over the beach and untouched, whereas the eagle is almost non-existent. I believe those pieces of moved wood for bridges and those burn pieces come from the eagle, as do the pieces we find on Eagle Beach. But I believe they've been salvaged by a group of Inuit that used to live on the island, and they were led by this gentleman here on the right. This is a guy called Olnik. He was well known to the whalers. He traded with them regularly. He's regularly mentioned in the logbooks. And he made his way to Dundee in the late 1870s and stayed with, I don't remember the name of the captain, but he requested passage back to Dundee. He stayed with the whaling captain, and he lived in Dundee for a winter. He became a fairly famous local celebrity. He had an audience with the Prince of Wales. He was a pretty remarkable guy. And then went back to Baffin, and he's reported on as salvaging wrecks. He was seen in the wreck of the Ravenscraig further south, and then he accidentally set it on fire. And it sounds like he'd been salvaging the wreck of the Eagle. There was, we were on Eagle Beach, and Robert, who was a part of our expedition team in 2019, is from Clyde River, which is the next community south from this site. And he looks at the island and he says to me, there's a story of a bell on that island, which is very likely the bell from the Eagle. But it still doesn't explain, really, if Olnik is doing all this salvaging, it really doesn't explain why he didn't salvage Nova Zembla until we get to 1900. And in 1900, while the whalers are again back in this harbour, so 2 years before Nova Zembla wrecks, Olnik dies. And this is a photograph of his funeral. The whalers were there. It's reported on in the Dundee Courier. So there's a picture of this. There's a drawing of this picture and a report about Olnik and his life. And then I discovered an oral history paper from Clyde River by an anthropologist, and it talks about settlements around the region, and it talks about this settlement on this island, and it says when their leader dies, the son-in-law takes over and they all move south. So sometime later in 1900, this group of people, about 40 people, move south, and then no one goes back. No one's lived there since. So in 1902, when Nova Zembla is wrecked, it's left untouched. So we were meant to go back this year. Obviously, circumstances stopped that. You can see here, number one, this is the beach where Nova Zembla is. Number two, this is the beach where Eagle is, which we were hoping to investigate further and see if we could find those engines in the water. And three, which was probably going to be the most interesting, was this is where we think Olnik's settlement is. And we think this is where that story of the bell originates from, and the bell's probably there. But we think the settlement incorporates wreckage from the Eagle, which would be really interesting from an archaeological point of view. Hopefully we'll get back there in 2022. I don't think there's any chance of going up this year either, but there's plenty of archival work to be done in the meantime. So I'm going to leave it there, and I'm more than happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Matt. Fascinating. Quite an expedition, and it seems that it's actually an enjoyable way of carrying out your daily work as well. These, places that are quite inaccessible. We have a couple of questions. Firstly from Brian. Is it possible to get it's up the screen there? Brian's just wondering if there was any incentive to preserve these materials using polyethylene glycol and climate-controlled environments, such as use preservation of barrier erosion and the Vasa volcanic stock, as water can severely degrade these materials.
Honestly, the amount of money it would take to recover this and preserve it, it's probably not worth it. there's a lot of strict permitting in Nunavut, especially around marine archaeology, certainly since the discovery of HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. We may look to recover some of this when we finally go back for preservation, but it's only going to be small amounts. If we were to recover any of the big bits, we're getting into the millions just to get it back. Never mind store it and then the chemicals required. So the best we can do is really survey it to the best of our ability and record it and go from there. I think what this has really highlighted, though, is there is actually quite a wealth of whaling heritage, Scottish whaling heritage on Baffin Island, and much of it has been undocumented. And I would largely say undiscovered, though a lot of the local communities know where much of this stuff is. Whether they know what it is a different matter. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thanks, Matt. It seems, reading the points that people are making, that there seems to be some difficulty in hearing the sound. Sorry, we're not sure why, but we will continue. One person is asking about, is this transcribed? No, it's not. But as I said at the beginning, we hope that this video can be made available online. I'm sorry, that's probably not going to help the sound much. We will try and sort that for future. We have another couple of questions. One, sorry, just right.
About the transcribed logs was around the logs that Matt referred to in his talk, so whether or not they've been transcribed and are available digitally online anywhere.
Some of them are, some of them aren't. So if you search for the ARCdoc project, so ARCdoc, that's the project I did my PhD under at the University of Sunderland, and the whaling logbooks that were transcribed from Hull are available via the Hull University Hydra repository. I can see if I can find a link while I'm talking to you and put it in the chat. And that doesn't show the images of the logs, that just shows the environmental information that came out of that.
Okay, thanks, Matt. There's another question there. Is it possible to age a wreck by how much growth it has accumulated and by what has grown on it?
Yes, you could do that. I think that's one of the things they're hoping to do with Erebus and Terror, because they don't know exactly when they sank. With Nova Zembla, we know the exact moment that it wrecked. So it's quite unusual for a site in terms of, we know it sank at 10:20 p.m. on the 18th of September 1902. But that also means it could be used as a baseline for marine growth, as opposed to using marine growth to age it, because we already have such a detailed account. In fact, it was more a bit of fun while we were there, but Tommy, the geologist who was with us, used a piece of the wreckage that was on the tundra, so it had been pushed right up onto the tundra, but it had seaweed below it, so it was clearly an old high tide line, and he used that to approximate the isostatic rebound of the area based on the known date of the wreck. It was a few millimeters, but it was pretty interesting, that the fact that we had such a detailed account that it could be used for other means as well, such as that.
Thanks, Matt. Just one question I have. When you were talking about the crew abandoning the Nova Zembla, I thought I heard you say that they set fire to it. Is that correct? And why would they do that?
That is a very good question. So whalers were really superstitious. There's some really interesting stories about them burning effigies and while they're on board to ward off evil spirits. Why they burned wrecks is a complete mystery to me. There's a whaling historian called Basil Lubbock who wrote a book in 1930 something. I can't remember the exact date off the top of my head. He was really the last whaling historian who actually knew any of the whaling captains and actually got to talk to them. He describes it as a stupid practice, and he doesn't know why. I thought maybe it could have been to signal for help, but I have reports of wrecks, happening within 100 feet of another boat and them setting it on fire. When they leave it, it's clearly not for that. It could be for insurance, but you've lost your boat up in the Arctic. No one's going to get it. It could be. I was talking to a student here, a British student here in Calgary, who's from a naval family. He said his grandfather, who was a naval captain, said that the Navy were instructed to burn all British ships when they were lost, in case they were used by a foreign party to pass as a British ship. So it could be something along those lines, and a throwback to tradition that way. Honestly, it's a question I'd love to answer. It's one that perpetually eludes me.
Thanks. Still a bit of a mystery. I still see that we're getting comments about we're losing some sound, and apologies to everyone. We just don't know why this is happening. We'll try and sort it. Another question from Douglas. What would it take to get a permit to recover items, and where would the items likely go?
So any items that would be recovered would be property of the government of Nunavut. So ultimately, it'd be up to the government as to where they would go. To get a permit is extremely difficult. One, you need to be a professional archaeologist within Canada. We are the only team to have been issued a marine archaeological permit outside of Parks Canada with their investigations, Verbis and Terra. It depends what we wanted to do with them. So I think some of these pieces would make excellent educational and museum pieces. It would be great to take some wood samples to confirm that the ship was built in Bremerhaven, and we don't have anything that actually says it's Nova Zembla, as much as all the evidence points to it, and it's very unlikely to be any other ship given the huge amount of evidence we have. But further things like that will give us more information on how these ships are built. So we have to have a strong justification as to why we would want to recover something. Then we'd have to prove we have the funds to preserve them for that, ad infinitum. It's quite a labored process. You have to be able to prove you can look after that piece once you've taken it out of the context. For the lifetime it's likely to exist. And that's something we really don't have at the moment. So.
Okay. Right, there's a question just come in right now from Lorna. She's saying, thanks, Matt. You used parts of an oral history from a previous local. Did you have any contact with the Inuits living in the wider area regarding information handed down from families? I'm a Scot living near Perth and did my MSc at the University of Calgary 50 years ago. Thank you for your question, Lorna. We're good.
Yes, so I have. So the site lies between two communities, so Pond Inlet and Clyde River. Although the land itself is a Clyde River lands claims area, it's a winter hunting area, so the flow edge comes quite close to the land there, so it's very important for hunting seals. I have friends in both locations. So this end slide picture, this is in Pond Inlet before we left with some of the team and some of our friends up there, and we actually work with a youth project up there called Carvic. And one of the things we've been looking at is the whaling influence on Inuit culture and what whaling means within historical memory there, and how it changed life, because it really was the thing that started the transition from a nomadic lifestyle to a more settlement-based lifestyle. And what's fascinating is pretty much everyone I talk to and everyone I know is related to a whaler in Scotland. I managed to connect a young gentleman in Pond Inlet to a gentleman in Dundee who was related through Captain Bannerman, who was one of the Dundee whaling captains. But lots of the people up there and lots of the people I know are really interested in this. And there's these odd Scottish threads that persist through society there and still happen today. A lot of the music is very Scottish based because, you know, most of the whaling crews, even if they were English ships, had predominantly Scottish crews. So that whole cultural side of things and that history and that connection to the whaling has been, I guess the conversation around that has been galvanized more since we found this wreck, which has been really interesting, and it's something I'm hoping to continue as we get up there, when we get up there next.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, very interesting. A question from Michael is just again to do with the Indigenous people. Just, you know, are the areas that you're looking at, are they sacred lands to the Indigenous people?
So the site is on an Inuit lands claims area. So it's, while, you know, the whole of the Arctic is essentially Inuit land, the government has parceled off specific lands, specific areas of lands that are of particular importance to the community. This being one of them, and this is from a hunting perspective rather than any sort of religious-based site. So there are, you know, Inuit graves are particularly important, and we have to make sure not to disturb those if we do come across any. They're quite out in the open. They tend to be rocks just over a body. But one of the things we have to do is work very closely with the community to get permission to actually physically be there. So while we need our archaeological permits, we also need our land access permits and the blessing from the community to be there. And then we have to report all our activities back to these various institutions and communities.
I'm actually fascinated that after 130 years, there's still material on the beach. Obviously, timber is quite a valuable asset to anyone who may be about. And it can't have been 130 years since there was a licensing agreement to stop people actually going onto the landing parties going onto the land there. So, yeah, I'm quite surprised that there's so much stuff just lying about.
It's that remote. It's, you know, to get there in summer it's over 200 kilometers of an open sea journey. You can't walk there. In the winter, it's very easy. You can go across the landfast ice, which acts basically like the highway up and down the island. So people go a lot in winter, but of course everything's covered in snow and ice, so you can't see it. People have been to this site before. We were quite surprised to find an aircraft fuel cache. It turns out it's a refueling spot for helicopters and twin otter planes, which are predominantly used for research up there. Nobody had reported the site, but that's kind of modern visitation. We also found a bit of graffiti carved into one of the bits of wood from 2014 in Inuktitut Sabalex. That happens to be a gentleman from Pond Inlet that a friend knows. I showed her a picture and he was like, "Oh yeah, that's so and so. He lives down the street." You know, and if you are Inuit, you are welcome to go there. You know, there are no restrictions. It's your land. It's just if you're not, you need all these permissions. But because it's such a difficult place to get to, in that period where it would have been of use in terms of salvage and a useful material, no one was there for, you know, probably over 70 years. Which is why it all exists. And I think it's quite unique given its remoteness. I think a lot of the sites closer to communities are far more salvaged.
Okay, thank you, Matt. That was really excellent, very informative, and I don't see any more questions, so it just leaves me to say thank you very much. And you know, wish you all success with further exploration and further discovery up there. And we hope to see you in Scotland again sometime. I know you're from here originally, but it'd be nice to see you back and in person. So thank you again. At this point, we'll be asking the audience to applaud you, but I'm sure you can hear the applause way up there in Calgary. So, again, thank you very much. Thank you again, everyone who has been watching tonight, and I'm sure you agree that was absolutely fantastic talk by Matt. They're up on the screen just now. You'll see our next two virtual meetings. We are continuing with the virtual meetings as long as COVID is amongst us. We have no option on that. It seems to be working very well, and we can invite people from people like Matt from distant places. And I noticed a few people. One gentleman from Brazil joined us tonight. One person from Brazil joined us tonight. Nice to see that we have a much wider audience than we normally would have in Edinburgh. So again, on behalf of the RMetS Scottish Committee, I would like to thank everyone for participating tonight, and especially thanks, Matt, for you taking the time to prepare and give us this excellent talk. Thank you.